Hello chaps, Paul Curran here. I hope you and all the listeners are well. Robert Frost lived from March the 26th, 1874 until January the 29th, 1963. In a 1970 review of the poetry of Robert Frost, the poet Daniel Hoffman describes Frost's early work as the Puritan ethic turned astonishingly lyrical and enabled to say out loud the sources of its own delight in the world, and comments on Frost's career as the American bard. He became a national celebrity, nearly the official US poet laureate, and a great performer in the tradition of that earlier master of the literary vernacular, Mark Twain. Robert Frost received 4 Pulitzer Prizes for his poetry and 40 honorary degrees without ever having achieved a degree himself. His life was difficult. His first child died of cholera very young, and it was after a trip to England in about 1912, I think, that he managed to begin to establish himself as a poet. He returned to America in 1915, and he was then in the fortunate position of having different publishers try and publish his work for him, the same publishers that had refused it before his trip to England. In England, he met Ezra Pound and befriended Edward Thomas, who we've encountered earlier. He wrote Adelstrop, of course, and it was during a walk in England with Edward Thomas and Thomas's indecision along the way that Frost first had the idea of writing what is perhaps his best known poem, the Path Not Taken. Anyway, with it being this most wonderful time of the year, I thought I'd begin this week's Poetry Corner with a poem called Christmas Trees by Robert Frost. I think it sometimes has the secondary title, A Circular Christmas Letter. And I'm sure you'll be able to detect in this writing Frost's love of the American dialogue. It goes like this. The city had withdrawn itself and left at last the country to the country. When between worlds of snow not come to lie and worlds of foliage not yet laid, there drove a stranger to our yard, who looked the city, yet did in country fashion, in that there he sat and waited till he drew us out a buttoning coats to ask him who he was. He proved to be the city come again, to look for something it had left behind, and could not do without, and keep its Christmas. He asked if I would sell my Christmas trees, my woods, the young fir balsams, like a place where houses all are churches and have spires. I hadn't thought of them as Christmas trees. I doubt if I was tempted for a moment to sell them off their feet to go in cars and leave the slope behind the house all bare, where the sun shines now no warmer than the moon. I'd hate to have them know it if I was. Yet more I'd hate to hold my trees, except as others hold theirs or fuse for them, beyond the time of profitable growth, the trial by market everything must come to. I dallied so much with the thought of selling. Then, whether from mistaken courtesy and fear of seeming short of speech, or whether from hope of hearing good of what was mine, I said, there aren't enough to be worthwhile. I could sell how many they would cut. You let me look them over. You could look, but don't expect I'm going to let you have them. Pasture they spring in, some in clumps too close that lop each other of boughs, but not a few quite solitary and having equal boughs all round and round. The latter he nodded yes to, or passed to say beneath some lovely one with a buyer's moderation. That would do. I thought so too, but wasn't there to say so. We climbed the pasture on the south, crossed over, and came down on the north, he said, 1,000. 1,000 Christmas trees? At what a piece? He felt some need of softening that to me. 1,000 trees would come to $30. Then I was certain I had never meant to let him have them. Never show surprise. But $30 seemed so small beside the extent of pasture I should strip. 3 cents, for that was all they figured out apiece. 3 cents so small beside the dollar friends I should be writing to within the hour would pay in cities for good trees like those. Regular vestry trees whole Sunday schools could hang enough on to pick off enough. 1,000 Christmas trees I didn't know I had. Worth 3 cents more to give away than sell, as may be shown by a simple calculation. Too bad I couldn't lay one in a letter. I can't help wishing I could send you one, in wishing you herewith a Merry Christmas. Robert Frost's Christmas Trees. Now, I forgot to mention in Poetry Corner of a couple of months back, 6 weeks ago perhaps, that I'd spent an evening in Stratford Library, which was full, listening to a friend read from her latest book. And she's extremely successful as a writer. Her name's Susan Fletcher, and her latest book is called House of Glass. The reason I mention this is that with Christmas presents being top of most people's lists at the moment, her book would make a tremendous gift, as it's set at Hidcote, in the gardens particularly of Hidcote Manor, and it's set in 1914 and tells the tale, a ghostly Gothic tale of goings on in the house then, and the main protagonist, a young woman, has been asked to establish a garden similar to that of Kew for the owner of the house. It comes highly recommended. I haven't been able to prize the copy at home from my mother yet, but I hear it's well worth a read. So that's Susan Fletcher's House of Glass. And similarly, with Christmas presents in mind, there's a lady who lives in Brailes, and she's called Linda Wiggin, and she's just written a book aimed more at children. She in fact wrote it for her 2 boys while she was being treated for and recovering from breast cancer. The name of that book is Power of Three, and like Sue's book, that can be bought on Amazon. Linda has very generously said that all the proceeds from this first edition of her book, Power of Three, will go to Cancer Research UK. And I read an article which featured Linda in it on the Oxford Mail, and therein she speaks of how privileged she feels to be able still to read her boys bedtime stories. I believe that too is a story which involves ghosts or witches, but there are 2 strong recommendations there: Sue Fletcher's House of Glass and Linda Wiggins' Power of Three. Okay, from one voice, one very distinctive American voice, Robert Frost. Incidentally, he can be heard reading some of his poetry. It's magnificent. Mending Wall is a poem that we can hear him read. It's on the internet, and he had a great sonorous voice, as did the next poet that I'm going to look at. Those faithful listeners amongst you will recall that exactly a year ago I read some prose, some Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, which I'd been asked to read at the Alternativity service, which takes place at the Guild Chapel in Stratford-upon-Avon. It's a nativity service, but with slightly different readings to the traditional ones. Well, that service took place this year, last weekend, but I was unable to attend it as I was in Wales. I was required to be in Wales, near Narberth, and on the return journey with my friend Will, not only did we see a cafe, which was named after the guitarist from the Shadows, Hank Marvin, which I think we both regret not having visited. Not only did we pass this cafe, but we also saw a sign for Dylan Thomas Boathouse. And having looked further into that, I wish we had pulled over, because it was a sign to the boathouse that Dylan Thomas had first visited when he was 19 years old. And Thomas died young at the age of 39. It's well known. His dates were the 27th of October 1914 to the 9th of November 1953. He was 39 years old when he died in New York. But in 1934, I think it was, he encountered this boathouse in Laugarn, forgive my pronunciation. Yes, it was in 1934, and he was 19 years old then. But he returned, and some of his most well-known work was written in this boathouse. Do not go gentle into the good night, and death shall have no dominion. Certainly the first of those was written there. And also his play for voices, Under Milk Wood. Anyway, here is a depiction from Dylan Thomas of Christmas. This is taken from A Child's Christmas in Wales. One Christmas was so much like another in those years around the Seatown corner, now and out of all sound except the distant speaking of the voices I sometimes hear a moment before sleep, that I can never remember whether it snowed for 6 days and 6 nights when I was 12, or whether it snowed for 12 days and 12 nights when I was 6. All the Christmases rolled down toward the two-tongued sea, like a cold and headlong moon, bundling down the sky that was our street, and they stop at the rim of the ice-edged, fish-freezing waves, and I plunge my hands in the snow and bring out whatever I can find. In goes my hand into that wool-white, bell-tongued ball of holidays, resting at the rim of the carol-singing sea. And out come Mrs. Prothero and the fireman. It was on the afternoon of the Christmas Eve, and I was in Mrs. Prothero's garden waiting for cats with her son Jim. It was snowing. It was always snowing at Christmas. December, in my memory, is white as Lapland, though there were no reindeers, but there were cats, patient, cold, and callous. Our hands wrapped in socks, we waited to snowball the cats. Sleek and long as jaguars, and horribly whiskered, spitting and snarling, they would slink and slide over the white back garden walls. And the lynx-eyed hunters, Jim and I, fur-capped and moccasined trappers from Hudson Bay off Mumbles Road, would hurl our deadly snowballs at the green of their eyes. The wise cats never appeared. We were so still, Eskimo-footed Arctic marksmen in the muffling silence of the eternal snows, eternal ever since Wednesday, that we never heard Mrs. Prothero's first cry from her igloo at the bottom of the garden, or, if we heard it, it was to us like the far-off challenge of our enemy and prey, the neighbour's polar cat. But soon the voice grew louder. "Fire!" cried Mrs. Prothero, and she beat the dinner gong. And we ran down the garden with the snowballs in our arms toward the house, and smoke, indeed, was pouring out of the dining room, and the gong was bombilating, and Mrs. Prothero was announcing ruin like a town crier in Pompeii. This was better than all the cats in Wales standing on the wall in a row. We bounded into the house laden with snowballs, and stopped at the open door of the smoke-filled room. Something was burning all right, Perhaps it was Mr. Prothero, who always slept there after midday dinner with a newspaper over his face. But he was standing in the middle of the room, saying, "A fine Christmas," and smacking at the smoke with a slipper. "Call the fire brigade," said Mrs. Prothero, as she beat the gong. "They won't be there," said Mr. Prothero. "It's Christmas." There was no fire to be seen, only clouds of smoke, and Mr. Prothero standing in the middle of them, waving his slipper as though he was conducting. "Do something," he said. And we threw all our snowballs into the smoke. I think we missed Mr. Prothero, and ran out to the telephone box. "Let's call the police as well," Jim said, "and the ambulance. And Ernie Jenkins, he likes fires." Excellent. What vivid images Dylan Thomas manages to create then. Sounds like great fun. Before his drinking days. Well, there we are. Two very distinct approaches to this time of year. And it's a time of tradition, really. I think increasingly, as a nation, we tend to view tradition with suspicion. But there's no doubt that it's at this time of year that the old familiar things we associate with Christmas are very reassuring. And with that in mind, I'd just like to mention my consternation at the news I heard recently that the pews in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, where Shakespeare's buried, of course, the pews that have been there since Victorian times are set to be removed. I'm not familiar with the specifics, but from what I've heard, the congregation has been asked to choose between several chairs, whereas it seems to me they should perhaps have been asked to choose whether or not they wanted the pews to be removed in the first place. The reasons being given are various, the pews being heavy to move for when the church is required for things other than worship, and that the pews are uncomfortable, by which I think we can read they are not perhaps as comfortable as some would like. Anyway, be that as it may, I think it would be a great shame if the pews were to be removed from the church. With them, the hassocks and hymn books in front of you as we're familiar. So I've taken it upon myself to write to the Bishop of Coventry, because there is precedence for a Grade 1 listed building like Holy Trinity to have stopped removal of pews and things. So I just want to make sure that it's being considered before it's done. And I have got an email address here for the Bishop of Coventry. If any of the listeners feel that they too would like to have his ear, and that is simply bishop@bishop-coventry.org. bishop@bishop-coventry.org. And he is the Right Reverend Dr. Christopher Coxsworth, Bishop of Coventry. Now, I began a few moments ago with the sound of Drunk in December, a new Christmas track by Victoria Bolster and her band out of Isker, which is well worth a listen. And I was going to conclude today by reading the lyrics of a wonderful song by Joni Mitchell called River, which was recorded in 1970, which is, again, a Christmas song. But I think that it would be diminishing to that wonderful record if I were to read the lyrics out. So perhaps chaps in the studio might be able to find it. But if not, I certainly recommend to those people who don't know River by Joni Mitchell that they give it a listen. It's quite sensational. And all that's left is for me to wish you a happy remainder of this year and a poetic start to the next. Rumpa-pum-pum.